Hello and welcome back to The Independent Pianist. It's your host, Cole Anderson, as always. Apologies for the odd day of my upload this week. As has been happening quite frequently, I've been finding my Fridays and Saturdays to get very busy very quickly. So I actually had everything for this video ready on Friday, but I just didn't have time to sit down and actually record myself talking to you and then get the whole thing put together. It just wasn't quite on the cards, and then Saturday was completely busy from morning till night, and Sunday I had to leave. So I'm coming to you from my hotel room right now on one of my journeys, and I'm very happy to be bringing you this video because this is the final video on my long-standing series on Liszt's Première Année de Pèlerinage, the Switzerland Year of Pilgrimage. I've done all the other pieces in the series so far, and this is the ninth and final piece in the series. So you can find all the other videos covering all those other pieces on my Liszt playlist. I've actually arranged them at the beginning of the playlist, so you can see that. It should be popping up in the corner of the screen right now. And this is a very underplayed piece, but an extremely beautiful one, cloches de Genève, the Bells of Geneva. And in understanding this piece, which has strong programmatic implications and strong biographical implications for Liszt's life, you have to know a little bit about his Swiss pilgrimage in real life. This was during the period when he was in self-imposed exile from France, from Paris, with his lover, the Countess Marie d'Agoult. They had left France to avoid the inevitable scandal attendant upon her pregnancy with their first child. So they traveled through Switzerland incognito, and their final stop was in Geneva, where they lived for some time in 1835. And the whole memory around this place where they lived was filled with a great deal of nostalgia and magic for them both. I know they both spoke about it, wrote about it for the rest of their lives as being a really special place for them. It was also the place where probably their relationship was at its most peaceful and beautiful. I don't think they ever were quite on the same terms after that, and of course eventually they ended up separating. The piece itself is most definitely related to the birth of their first child, Blandine. Of course, Geneva is famous for its bells, particularly the bells of the Cathedral Saint Pierre, I think are very well known. So Geneva was their final stop on this pilgrimage through Switzerland, so it's fitting that this should be the finale of this set, and a very, very beautiful and moving finale it is. Now, if we're going to talk about this piece, it's very important to talk about the two versions of it that exist. As was common with most of Liszt's work, in fact, this piece went through several different versions, and we have a preliminary version from the 1830s when he first wrote it. And of course, the final version that we know today was put into this form and published finally in the 1850s. So over 15 years later, that he did this final version. Most of the pieces in this set originated in his earlier Album d'un Voyageur, the album of the traveler. Not all of them, though, and sometimes they're wildly different. The two versions of Valet d'Obermann, for example, or Chapelle de Guillaume Tell are very, very different. Some of them are almost exactly the same, like Au Lac de Wallenstadt is almost word for word or note for note the same as it was in its earlier version. This is probably the piece that differs the most. I think even Valet d'Obermann, the difference is not as extreme as it is here. Basically, the entire structure was revamped, and in the entire overall mood and feeling of the piece. So in the original version, this piece is extremely lush and elaborate and long. It's like a long fantasy. It's kind of structured in two major sections. There's an opening kind of nocturne, and then there's a very Italianate melody which comes after that, very much reminiscent of Italian opera or Bellini or something like that. And both pieces have this. The thing is that they have completely different melodies. Actually, it's a totally different tune in the original. I can't remember now off the top of my head if it's a folk tune or not. I haven't studied the original as closely, although it's going to appear on this channel at some point. But suffice it to say, they're very different, completely different melodies. And in the original also, kind of akin to his operatic fantasies, he has the opening nocturne motive with this bell-like effect, which also opens the revised version, kind of combined in with the Italianate melody as it's unfolding. There's also a very programmatic moment where you hear the bells striking 10. We can assume it's 10 o'clock. I know that Alan Walker posits that that might have been the hour of Blandine's birth. I don't know if that's substantiated, but it certainly makes sense. The music kind of stops, and you can hear this tolling of the bell in the background. It's very, very beautiful. There's a lot of very elaborate figuration in this earlier version as well. It's very much in tune with the style of his operatic fantasies, only very subtle, very understated, and very much in the style of a nocturne as well. So a lot of the figuration does remind me of Chopin's famous D-flat nocturne from his Opus 27 set. It has more of that kind of extremely elaborate, beautiful, melismatic figuration, but also very, very long, as I've said. And it makes sense in the revised version that Liszt decided to pare things down to a much more classical, restrained kind of structure. I believe that Liszt was probably considering the entire set as a whole. I mean, I'm sure that he expected that performers would excerpt individual works, but he also seems to have maybe been considering the rhythm of the pieces if they were played complete, which is quite effective, actually, particularly in this first set of the Aîné de Pèlerinage. It really works quite well to perform the pieces complete. As long as you're not expecting the final piece to be some kind of blaze of glory, the whole thing has a very beautiful kind of rhythm to it. But the obvious emotional center of the work, the most intense portion of the work, is Orage, followed by Valet Dobermann. So Valet Dobermann acts as kind of the center point. So it makes sense that he's kind of pared down Cloches de Genève a little bit so that it doesn't interfere so much with this kind of structuring. It would be a little bit more unwieldy if you had this huge big piece right in the middle of the set, and then you have another one again at the end. Also, maybe he just felt that the emotions of this piece were better suited to something more intimate and kind of restrained. I don't know. And of course, the argument over which version is better, I'm sure, rages very high among people who actually know that there are two versions. It's an obscure enough piece that I'm sure many people probably haven't even heard of the revised version, let alone the original one, which is very infrequently performed. So I love them both. I think within the context of the set, the revised version is perhaps superior, but the original as a standalone work is incredibly beautiful and marvelously written. It's one of the best things Liszt did in his earlier years as a composer, before his retirement, of course, and when he dedicated himself to composing and revised all of his earlier works. That original version of Cloches de Genève is just such a beautiful piece and stands out as one of the masterworks. So I am going to be recording that one at some point. Today we have the revised version. The revised version, it's much more classical in style, as many of his revisions are. He clarifies many of the structural points, simplifies many things, and kind of puts it in this very intimate setting. And in its restraint and clarity of form, this piece does remind me of certain of Chopin's nocturnes. It's basically through composed, so you get this opening nocturne, which is fairly short, and then you get a longer section with this kind of Italian aria. There is a very brief recall to the nocturne at the end, but it's not complete, and it's been transformed. The meter has been transformed into the same meter as the Italian aria. So the opening nocturne is in 3, it's in 6/8, and then the aria is in a duple meter, it's in 2/4. So it particularly reminds me of some of Chopin's through composed nocturnes, like the G minor Opus 15 number 2, for example, in which in that nocturne there's no repetition at all. It just kind of goes from section to section, and it also has a very intimate kind of character and kind of restrained character. So the piece does begin with this bell-like fragment, a suggestion of the bells. This does become an important motive, though, also later on. So then immediately after these little bells that we hear at the beginning, that transfers into the accompaniment, and we get this beautiful nocturne melody in the right hand. There's a very interesting phrase structure to this opening nocturne. I mean, it's basically just two phrases. The first one trails off into this kind of cadenza-like passage, and then we get a little bit of a pause. We hear more of these kind of distant, hazy bell effects, and then the melody repeats, only this time it actually reaches a point of completion, where before it kind of trailed off. So that little trail off on the end of the first phrase is actually very important, though. That's going to come back when we get this Italian aria in the second part of the piece. Liszt makes a kind of recurring idea out of this cadenza-like thing that happens, where the aria kind of pauses for a moment on a note, and then it has this kind of beautiful melismatic cadenza. And each one is a little bit different. They all have a slightly different outline and style, and you can trace the growth of the material and the emotional journey that you're going on by the way that the cadenzas kind of change one from the next. So I thought it might be kind of fun to put all of these cadenzas side by side, just to hear them one right after the other, so you can kind of hear how the piece is developing, what its trajectory is from beginning to end. So here we go, every single one of these cadenzas in the piece, one right after the other. So it's amazing. All these cadenzas, the figuration, of course, is very reminiscent of Chopin. Also, it's amazing how he varies every single one slightly and notates them very precisely. So it's really important to look very closely at what he's writing. Sometimes he gives a little bit of a retard or something else like that, but always very carefully constructed, every single one. And then, as I mentioned, the opening nocturne does return in a very basic form. So the melody doesn't actually come back, but we do hear these bell effects from the opening recapped at the end. And Liszt writes this absolutely wonderful poetic coda, this short coda, where you can hear this last kind of tolling of these distant bells, and that occurs in the left hand, marked here. And I think it's pretty subtle in the notation. I think you might miss this, really, but you really should play these left-hand notes like bells. They should be pretty sonorous and emphasized a little bit, I think, from everything else. You really should be able to hear that effect. So here's how I tried to do it. I don't know if it's successful or not, but this was my take on it. So other than that, there's not much more to be said about this. This is one of the most beautiful pieces in the set. Stay tuned for the complete performance coming up. As always, do please consider supporting the channel if you like the content that I'm bringing you. You can do that very easily at www.patreon.com/independent pianist. Or if you would prefer not to make financial donations right now, it's also plenty to just hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and come back next week. Oh, in fact, sooner than next week. Since I missed my Friday upload last week, I'm planning to do another video this Friday if I can get to it. I should have a little bit more of an open Friday. So thanks for tuning in, and until next time, this is Cole Anderson signing off.